Do it. Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
Do it. Do it.
Who is doing it?
Do it.
Do it.
All of it.
Do it.
Come on, do it now.
You got two ways to do this. You can build it up in a capacitor, catch it, discharge it into the battery, and then you want to repeat this process over and over and over. But what you really want to do is you want to go as fast as you can without a capacitor, for the simple fact is you want to put a lot of this radiant energy to the source.
again. I'm Dan Winter, as you know, plankfire.com, fractalfield.com, on YouTube, Dan Winter Fractal Field. We're here today to talk about how a charged vortex makes gravity, the real simplified essence and elegance of how electrogravitics work. This is a precise but powerful, simple, elegant electrical explanation now available to children, available to anyone except those who have no real clue why objects fall to the ground. Remember, without this real electrogravitics, the dizzy woo-woos and dizzy religions, governments, and universities will absolutely never have an understanding of the plasma physics of the power of mind. Mind is a name for the charged plasma vortex that forms in the synaptic array of the brain when that superfluid liquid crystal charged plasma vortex inside your head, inside the synapse, implodes. And that centripetal making force, which is also a gravity making force, is the absolute essence of the nature of mindfulness. So this secret of gravity making tech, literally directional implosive charge collapse, hint plankfire.com. It's not so much hidden by some kind of evil secret deep state technology as it is hidden by absolutely lazy thinking, which could now be absolutely sorted out by any reasonably clear-minded 5-year-old who hopefully is too young to be bewildered by Einstein's terribly lost space-time is bent confusion. What a bunch of crap. Excuse me. When charge accelerates towards center, that acceleration of charge towards center speeds up the spin rate. And the relative rate of spin is sometimes called time. The better term for that is simply relative spin rate. So there's nothing confusing or mystical about it. The fact that when you implode, compress, charge, the spin rate speeds up. For example, if you accelerate a donut, the spin rate at center speeds up, called time. So where's the mystery here? So much confusion has been introduced by, Einstein made all these fabulous contributions, true, very, very well. But they're also, along with the contributions, were some horrible, horrible, horrible confusions, like I call them the symptoms of Einstein-induced insanity, not having a clue why objects fall to the ground, for example, thinking the speed of light is a speed limit. What a bunch of crap. Thinking it takes infinite energy to go through the speed of light. Wrong. Thinking all action at a distance is spooky. Wrong. Not having a clue what the ether is made of, simply the superfluid liquid charge. Incorrectly and weirdly somehow believing that space-time is bent. It's just a way to confuse the kids. It ain't helpful. Not understanding that both mass and time are created and defined simply by the inertia and period of charge rotation. So our slide number 2, I've prepared a handy slide here for the use of people like Gaia TV, Ancient Aliens, Michael Salla, Stephen Greer, Elena Denon, Dan Willis, Gene Decode, and hundreds more. This slide should be presented to prefix their presentations on gravity technology. Warning! In the following, they are going to pretend to give the illusion to teach how repressed anti-gravity tech works. However, it must be made clear that since they also don't have a clue why objects fall to the ground, and therefore also have no clue how a charged vortex makes gravity, the real key to electrogravitics. So they clearly need to apologize in advance for pretending to teach something about which they are clueless. Now, you know me, I'm double Scorpio here. We love sting. Excuse me. I'm old and crotchety. Well, am I crotchety? So I just run out of patience when I look at all these sources that are pretending to teach our friends interested in spirituality and science. They're pretending to teach gravity science, and all they're doing is absolutely confusing the issue by simply not understanding the pure principle, which obviously is implosive charge collapse. So after a while, I get a little bit pissed off and impatient. Now I know that most any government on the planet is willing to kill to get this technology. Electrogravitics, how you implode a vortex and make gravity? Well, anybody who knows that is going to win World War III. I mean, they're going to conquer the world. They're better than the CIA. All of the above. Yes, true. Also, though, anybody who doesn't understand electrogravitics is never, ever going to understand the power of mindfulness. So hello, yes, we must be willing to take the risk to teach what every government on the planet is willing to kill to prevent you from knowing, which is how electric physics works, because otherwise you'll never know the power of mind. You'll never know how plasma, sometimes called implosive plasma, sometimes called physicsofsoul.com, goes through death, that implosion in the plasma. So I say it's this kind of delusional, irresponsible teaching, hello, list above, which is largely responsible for creating millions of confused, delusional woo-woos instead of actual people who understand the science of consciousness. So double Scorpio who's getting old and crotchety, and so I decided, which is a noble tradition of double Scorpio, to see how many friends I can piss off, I mean make angry, by telling the truth. Hello, you need to know how a vortex makes gravity if you want to understand about any ancient spiritual mystery / power of mind, how soul is created, in addition to knowing how to make the kind of energy and propulsion, which makes every other kind of energy on this planet look like the Stone Ages. Step number 1, know how a charged vortex becomes implosive, creates gravity, and makes propulsion. You need to know for yourself. At some point, the language of hundreds of woo-woos who do not have a clue why objects fall to the ground just ain't going to help unless you learn the physics principle for yourself. And that's why we're here. We're here to talk about the physics of actually how a vortex makes gravity. And like I say, when we're done, if your 5-year-old can't explain it back to you, I didn't do this right. Okay, so here it is. Look, any physicist who currently believes that gravity and electromagnetism are made of different stuff, those physicists we recommend be hospitalized for schizophrenia. The other physicists actually could have a clue that the same superfluid compressible we call charge, sometimes called yin and yang, sometimes called ether, that's a superfluid, which fills the universe. Okay, now waves in that media, the universal substrate media called ether of charge, the superfluid, the compressibility of that medium is called plus and minus charge, obviously. Okay, so now the only thing the universe is made of is the waves of that charge. There is nothing else. And anybody who pretends there is something else, oh, there's something else besides the material world, those woo-woos need to be hospitalized, really, because they have schizophrenia. No. All we have is waves of charge, and that is spiritual and beautiful and fun. Yeah. So when we have a wave of charge, there's basically 2 waves for waves to propagate. As like a wave in the ocean, and we've said this 1,000 times, it's like the P wave, the pressure wave, versus the S, the shear wave, in the way an earthquake propagates in the land. So you got a compressional wave, which is called longitudinal, where the axis of the compressional wave is parallel to the direction of propagation of that wave, called the longitudinal compressional wave, versus the transverse up and down component. Now, every wave has some of both. For example, as we've always said, a tsunami, a tsunami under the ocean is mostly longitudinal. The boat on top doesn't know the wave went under. But when it hits the shore, that vortex curve of the side of the ocean, pushing the vortex upwards, converts part of that longitudinal inertia of the tsunami traveling at the speed of a jet plane. It takes it takes the longitudinal inertia of that compressional tsunami, and because the side of the vortex is the curve of the slope of the shoreline, the compressional wave is converted, a major part of the inertia is converted by bouncing against the side of the vortex of the shoreline into the up and down component shear wave called transverse wave. We're talking about a water wave here, but we're directly implying the metaphor of electromagnetic wave. So that up and down component called transverse, which is traveling perpendicular to the direction of propagation. So the transverse electromagnetics is what all our radio, all our communication, everything is based on, even though our sound waves are based mostly on longitudinal component. The point is that physics does not know how to deal with, to communicate with, to make radio of, anything to do with longitudinal electromagnetics. Most physicists don't actually know what a longitudinal electromagnetic wave is, not to mention how to send it and to receive it, because only mostly biology does that. Hello. So anyway, when on the left, the transverse up and down wave hits the side of that vortex and goes down the vortex if the vortex is the right angle. Remember, we're getting to how a charged vortex makes gravity. This is the key point here. So that the transverse wave from the left bounces down that vortex if the vortex is the right angle. Hint, see the side view. It looks like a caduceus. That there is 510 spirals of the golden mean on that precise vortex cone, which I have proved by equation is precisely the reason and the way hydrogen exists. Planckfire.com. So this is a physics professor's graph of the structure of hydrogen after they learn why an object falls to the ground and after they've seen my equation for the structure of hydrogen, exact golden ratio multiples times Planck, called Planckfire.com. The cause of charge collapse, which is the cause of gravity, consciousness, life force, and all negentropy and all action at a distance. So when that vortex converted the electromagnetic transverse on the left down the yellow brick road of the vortex, on the right then begins propagating as a longitudinal wave, the point is to begin to understand that when the transverse wave hits the side of nuclear critical mass, or your mind, when the transverse wave hits the side of the center of the plasma sphere, sometimes called a Foo Fighter, a Tic Tac? No, I mean sometimes called a plasma domain. When the transverse wave hits the side of a plasma domain, it makes a mess. I mean, it does not compress. I mean, it does not propagate. I mean, it is not effectively stored. I mean, it does not efficiently bounce. I mean, the transverse wave actually ain't the fun part. No. As we're going to show the slide of Tom Bearden's book in a moment, Electrogravitobiology, proving that gravity waves are made of only the longitudinal component of the electromagnetic wave. Hello. So if that vortex is more one-sided, then out the squirt gun of the nozzle precisely tuned by Planck on the right here, not only are you now propagating longitudinal waves instead of transverse, but you're squirting them like a squirt gun directionally. What if you could stand at the center of a vortex and squirt more longitudinal waves one way than the other way? What would that be called? Hint, clue, gravity. The asymmetry of the propulsive force. Now we're going to get to when you take two oil drums, visualize two oil drums, one inside the other, and between them you got this mercury vortex, right? Well, that mercury vortex has a certain asymmetry, spitting out more longitudinal one way than the other. So you're beginning to get a clue here that if you can stand in place and spit out a longitudinal wave directionally, this is the print. Now, here's another simple example just to kind of visualize this more clearly. So here's this famous doohickey, physics electrogravitic, called the EM drive. You can see it in the background here. It is a trapezoid shape down which a microwave cascade is bounced. Now these idiots, these scientists, do not happen to know that if you tuned that microwave bounce to Planckfire.com, you would make more gravity. Because they're dumb. Sorry. It's just because they're dumb. But so if that microwave cascade came to a point tuned by Planckfire.com, namely the perfected caduceus, namely the perfected fractal phase conjugate charge collapse, cause of gravity, called Planckfire.com, so that squirt gun now is squirting the longitudinal EMF due to that implosion directionally, which is the physics of how and why the EM drive makes gravity, which you could teach after you learned why objects fall to the ground. Oops, I think they might have a problem. But you just visualize, so the vorticity of the liquid crystal, the other good image of this actually is the Yeah, imagine this is the mercury vortex. It can be a water vortex or it can be a mercury vortex. The point is, for example, when it's a water vortex, it must be piezoelectrically charged. And the angle of that vortex, idealized 60-degree implosion cone, hint nest of dodeca, hint implosion. So when the angle of that vortex is correct, when the charge waves crash into each other and non-destructively impress, complode, self-cancel, the result of that self-canceling perfect caduceus phase conjugate charge collapse is the direction of the imploded longitudinal EMF goes one way. So whether this vortex is piezoelectrically charged water, whether it's piezoelectrically charged mercury. Now, in the case of the Vimana Nazi Bell, this is the mystery that all the dummies really haven't sorted out. In fact, originally in the Vimana, they used a certain wetting agent in the liquid mercury. And this is why mercury's in the pyramids, by the way, also too. It's a gravity maker. It's a gravity diode, pyramidwirelesspower.com. So they used a wetting agent to make the iron powder soluble in the mercury, the famous red mercury, because you have the mercury has high inertia, very useful here, but now you have to have that mercury vortex be highly charged, conductive, magnetically flux permissive, hence the dissolved iron powder making the mercury red. And the other famous mystery there was, well, the Nazi Bell Hanabu was radioactive. Why? It's actually quite simple. It's just like the famous Paul Brown nuclear battery. A very small amount of radioactive component has a quasi-superconductive induced effect. So a very low amount of radioactive component in many electric circuits, example, Paul Brown famous nuclear battery, they got enough radioactivity from welding rod to make the nuclear battery work. I mean, it wasn't rocket science. Well, it was rocket science. So by making a low-level radioactive effect with the gamma, etc., made the mercury vortex quasi-superconductive. Hint, now the charge vortex not only can it implode, but it can implode with electrical efficiency. So that's why the famous Nazi Bell, was actually radioactive. Now, there are much more elegant ways to do this. We're going to get to the fire crystal shortly. And the Nazis, even they were smart enough to dump the mercury vortex after they had their submarines with with the mercury vortex drives all over the solar system. They dumped that because, well, we'll get there. So here is a graphic of how and why that works. This is profound. After we proved that this is the only reason hydrogen and DNA and consciousness exist, right here, this picture, golden recursive constructive interference. That's the implosive. That is the physics of implosion. That is Planck-Fire. That's how the vortex has to be designed. And we know the frequency signature. Obviously, it's called Planck-Fire.com. Integer exponent of golden ratio times Planck length and time. The universal key signature of every wave in the universe. Planck length and time. So it's a musical key signature of every wave in the universe. And the reason is not because of the Big Bang. No, it's because that's how gravity propagates, which is also why golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. Talk about a smoking gun. Right after Professor Raymond Chow's thousands of measurements of speeds faster than the speed of light showed they all centered around 1.62 golden ratio times the speed of light. These are smoking guns that I am absolutely correct about the cause of gravity. And of course, this is then the physics of how our Therify.net, based on Antoine Prieur, my invention, works. This is also the physics of how the Schumann harmonics and the brainwave harmonics and the breath harmonics and the HRV harmonics of bliss all require specifically this frequency signature of implosion. So obviously we have a lot of slides about this, and I'm going to just review some of these slides quickly. On the right is our published equations in two major significant physics journals on the right, proving by equation that the generalized wave mechanics equation-based solution to constructive wave interference is in fact golden ratio. So golden ratio optimizes constructive wave interference in general. and therefore compression, the solution to compression. Hello, the problem that Einstein died unsolved. Big problem, infinite non-destructive compression. Well, the word was actually the answer, infinite. Anyway, so the publications are all at plankfire.com, Planck fire.com. And this is famously our partner Tom Bearden's book, Electrogravitics, Gravitobiology, proving that gravity waves are a name for the longitudinal component of the electromagnetic wave. Hello, is that news? So, and this is a little bit more about visualizing the sides of the Mercury vortex. In this case, this is the Schauberger repulsing, and the water had to be piezo, and the water vortex had to implode at the right angle, basically so that the donut could turn inside out recursively, constructively optimized by golden ratio, and therefore implode, and therefore spit out a longitudinal wave directionally, which is how you can get a handle on space-time. Okay, there you are. You're made of a wave, and the waves around you are all made of waves. Well, how do you get a handle on it in order to push? You need an implosive still point, which is spitting out a longitudinal EMF in one direction more than the other. How do you do that? Well, you need that vortex. Remember, visualize the two oil drums spinning in opposite directions with a Mercury vortex in between them called Nazi Bell Vimana Hanabu. And you get an idea how you make that vortex at the right angle to spit out a longitudinal wave in one direction more than the other, called electrogravitics, called gravity making. So there are thousands of graphics about this Mercury technology, but the key was getting the Mercury vortex charged, piezo, superconductive, and we've explained the EM drive. We've been through that. And so this is the vortex. And there's a certain romance here, like, oh, we call this the perfect Valentine. Oh, the perfect Valentine, very romantic, is also specifically the absolute physics of perfect bonding. I mean, the definition of the bond of power, so much so that this is actually the change of pressure over time in the perfected birth canal. Talked about bond of power, Joseph Chilton Peirce. So now you got all these guys running around like chickens without their head cut off, saying, the ETs are coming. I mean, the drones are coming. I mean, the Tic Tacs are coming. I mean, the plasma's coming. I mean, the Foo Fighters are coming. I mean, what is making those plasma domains able to be self-aware and self-directing? I mean, appear to be self-directing squirt guns. How do you make a plasma into a self-directing squirt gun? Well, if you got the angle of the vortex right. So the real principle here is that you cannot get a grip on the superfluid of the universal medium of charge called the ether, the universe. You don't get a grip or leverage on a still point there unless you get grounded, which is locked in phase with fractality and Planck. Definition of grounding for psychologists and electricians. Okay, that's access to fractal distribution defines grounding for psychologists and electricians. Absolutely. So that because you get leverage on the fractal array by locking yourself in phase with the still point, which means if you're walking around in thick sneakers on metal reinforced sidewalks in the big city, you ain't never getting the Schumann inside your body. You ain't never getting grounded, and you ain't never getting leverage. Sorry. You want leverage? You're going to need to lock to a still point. How do you do that? You need to implode. So that's the physics of grounding, the physics of fractality. And we have so many graphics of this. So this charge collapse, this implosive charge collapse is the physics of firecrystal.com. We have many presentations there. And this particular lecture also refers extensively to the concept of the physics of soul.com. That, remember, summarizing, when that implosive collapse, access to bliss, access to the heart rate variability, access to kundalini, access to that still point, the aura is enabled to compress and then propagates coherently into that longitudinal array called ancestor memory, collective unconscious, communion of saints. We got too many names. We don't have enough physics. And so in that coherent longitudinal array, which is the only
basically for what we would call a modern electromagnetic theory, we can start with the work of James Clerk Maxwell. That's usually a starting point most people take because he put it together based on Faraday's work. Faraday was a great experimenter and did a great number of experiments which showed very nice things. And Faraday had some concepts of his own which he advanced, but he did not mathematize it. He didn't make math models of it. Maxwell, for example, even made a statement that when he first started studying that, he made a vow not to look at anybody else's work until he finished capturing Faraday's work mathematically. So he set out to deliberately mathematize what Faraday had discovered working on the bench. And his actual theory, which is in a paper published in 1865, was orally delivered in 1864. His actual theory is 20 equations in 20 unknowns, quaternion and quaternion-like equations. The quaternion differs, understand at this time there were no vectors. Vector and tensor analysis were not yet born. And so what we had is various kinds of algebras and things like that. But quaternions had been created by Hamilton. And they were what we call a higher group symmetry. They captured lots of operations, intricate operations that today's theory does not capture at all. To give you an example, there's always a great dispute about Nikola Tesla's work. And most of the conventionally trained scientists assume that they know and understand everything Tesla did. They do not. One of the really fine electrodynamicists and electrical physicists we have in this country is a man named Terry Barrett. Barrett took a look at Tesla's actual patents, but he looked at them in quaternion algebra, the same kind of thing that Maxwell was originally using in his original theory. And surprisingly, there were many operations going on in these circuits that could be seen with quaternion electrodynamics, could not be seen with the best tensor analysis you could do. So Barrett published a paper on it to show what was actually going on in those circuits. He also saw some ways to improve what Tesla had been doing, and he filed and obtained 2 patents which are still used in communication industry and things like ultra-wideband radar. So it does work. But my point is that we started off with this better model, but it was much more complicated mathematics. Now in those days, the fashion was to call what we today would call electrical engineer, call them electricians. And most of them were more like electricians than what we would consider an electrical engineer. And for example, people like Heaviside looking at that said, you know, these poor electricians, they'll never learn these silly quaternions. That's far too complicated. This has got to be made simpler. He wasn't the only one that took that view, but he was the major one that played a major role in cutting down those equations and making them much easier and much simpler, and therefore losing lots of operations you can do. But a quaternion has one peculiar thing. It takes a vector, what we today will call a vector component, one that has direction as well as magnitude, and it sticks on the component that doesn't have any direction, just has magnitude. And people like Heaviside, who was totally self-taught, never went to university at all, but brilliant man, brilliant. We're not knocking Heaviside at all. Heaviside said, that's mixing apples and oranges, so let's chop off that part that's not got a direction. And that's the way vectors were born. Heaviside and Hertz and primarily an American also named Gibbs basically taught our scientists vector analysis. They created vector algebra, vector analysis. And they did it in refining and condensing and chopping up Maxwell's equations, Maxwell's original theory. They reduced it to a much smaller subset of the theory.
Can you paraphrase some of Maxwell's work narrowing it for our purposes in terms of how it is applied to the energy from the vacuum work that we'll be addressing overall.
Yes, Maxwell had one vision, and what he thought was the primary reality in electrodynamics was the potentials. Heaviside and the others thought the potentials were mysticism. They weren't even real. If it was not force, it had no reality in the physical world. It's all right. Most scientists thought that. So he thought that these were just mathematical niceties that Maxwell played around with. So one of his real jobs, he said, these things ought to be murdered from the theory. That was one statement that he made. One of his primary reasons was to get rid of the potentials, and he got rid of all of them but two.
Heaviside.
Heaviside did, and so did Hertz doing the same thing, and so did Gibbs doing the same thing in forming vector algebra and vector electromagnetics. The equations, for example, that are taught today at universities, Maxwell's equations, are not Maxwell's equations at all. They are Heaviside's truncated equations. But anyway, Heaviside took the view that, these potentials are mystical, we've got to murder them from the theory, and we've got to get rid of them, and so they did. Oddly, in today's modern physics, we know the potentials are what's real, and the force field is an effect made in matter after something much more fundamental interacts with the matter. It hasn't made it into electrical engineering yet in 50 years since we've known it. Maybe it will one of these days migrate from the physics department across the campus to the building where the electrical engineering department is and get them to change the thing. When you assume force fields in space, you assume a material ether, which everybody did when they first started the theory. Even Maxwell believed in a material ether.
How would you define that?
Material ether is that there's a thin gas, a thin material gas filling all space. And there's not a point in the universe where mass is absent. That's called the luminiferous ether. It was destroyed in 1887 by the Michelson-Morley experiments. All the electrical equations all assumed this material ether, and still do. They never changed a single equation. What they did one day is they got up and announced, well, there's no material ether, so we're not using one. And they kept right on with the same equations, all assuming the material ether. What you do in a case like that, it does not in freely and transfer it and shape and form the energy as you wish, and then interact that with matter. You form powerful forces without ever having to wrestle nature. And that's the way to do engineering. That's negative entropy engineering, which will be the engineering of the future if we ever get it born. Anyway, Maxwell's equations still had a much greater variety of things that you can do electromagnetically than our people can do today at the universities. This got truncated after his death. Maxwell died in 1879 of stomach cancer. And the Heaviside work and the other works only got going in the 1880s. Beginning of the 1880s is when they did most of their work. So after his death, his equations were severely truncated. Now I'm going to say something in Heaviside's defense. He was probably right when he said, our poor electricians will never be able to understand and grasp these quaternions. We've got to have something simpler. He was probably right on the mark. Because if they had not simplified it and oversimplified it, they would not have ever got it off the ground and running to make practical things. That is true.
Yeah. We had a problem in those days with both concept and calculation.
That's correct. So anyway, we get after Maxwell's death, we have the tremendous work of Heaviside. Gibbs' work gave the mathematics in circulated papers, which were widely circulated. And Hertz, who had a short life, but as you know, Hertz proved experimentally, I think some 9 years after Maxwell's death, that the equations Maxwell had said predicted waves actually did produce waves. The theory produced the waves, and he proved it experimentally. And at that time, after we finally had experimental demonstration of these waves, then science began to pay attention to Maxwell's theory, to the theory as it was then existing more in truncated form. Okay, we get along up towards the end of that century, when we get up towards 1900, another scientist of great impact on electromagnetics entered the picture, named Lorentz.
Before we go to Lorentz, I'm sorry to interrupt. What is it? I still don't get, and maybe I missed something. What is it about Maxwell's equations that is directly applicable now to energy from the vacuum?
Okay. Maxwell's equations do apply to energy from the vacuum because they apply to systems which are not, to be technical, are not yet symmetrically regauged. Now, what the devil does that mean? When you say regauge a system, you change its potential energy. You can change the potential energy of any system free as anywhere you wish, anytime you wish, and every electrodynamicist already assumes that and uses it, and so do the gauge field theorists. The gauge freedom axiom guarantees you don't have to pay work to change the energy of a system. You can have all the energy in the system you want to pour in there. You do not have to do work just to get the energy there.
I want you to define energy and potential.
Okay, there are two things that have no definition, but we'll define it.
Well, that's why I asked you.
Gotcha.
Anyway, if we change the energy density of space-time, you see, we make a curvature of space-time when we do. Now, at the time we're talking about, relativity hasn't been born yet, neither special nor general. So curvature of space-time is not a concept that's being used in science at all at the day we're talking about. They started with a model that they assumed never had a curvature of space-time and never had any change in the vacuum flux because there was no such thing known as a vacuum flux. Most of the particle physics for that had never been born. So we're in a time when, completely innocently, a very restricted theory which says that, you know, space-time never curves and that curvature then never interacts back on our system, which it does. And the vacuum never changes, it's just empty space, it never changes and doesn't interact back on our system, which it does, we know today. It does violently, but that's totally ignored in that theory. So even in Maxwell's theory, that was not known, so it's not in the equations. But if you take the equations, they still allow you to have extra energy coming in from outside and model this situation. Because now what you will have, it'll create a free field, not just a potential. You can do that for free. But the difference between that potential and some other potential at a different potential in the circuit gives you a field that's free because the potential to make that difference was free. Once you have that field, you have a free force field in that system, which we would call forward EMF, which will now push the electrons through the load and do some free power in the load till it dissipates that extra energy that we moved in for free. In other words, if we have an asymmetric means the fields didn't stay the same. You let the extra field get born for free. Didn't cost you anything. You made some force for free. You got it free from nature. Nature said, oh, you did fine. You moved in the energy and then you let me give you the force for free. And then this force can do work for you for free till it exhausts the energy that was extra. But you see, the equations, when you do that, when you have what we call asymmetry or broken symmetry in them, they're not symmetrical. And everybody loved symmetry. It was beautiful. They wanted to see the two sides of the human face just look like mirror images of each other. They didn't want to see one different from the other. Oh, that was ugly. So the mathematicians, chasing beauty, abhorred broken symmetry. They hated it. And it was nothing in the world but admiring the beauty of the equations when they were symmetrical. So when Lorentz came along, he regauged the equations symmetrically. Okay, what does that do? What did it do that it had to do with energy systems? Well, let's reason together. If my system is allowed by the equations to freely receive energy from outside, that doesn't cost me anything, and is allowed to freely use that energy to power the load, can I not free energy from what the source is providing all that from outside, which today we know is curved space-time and the active vacuum? the environment. Yes, we could do that with those original equations, but if we make them symmetrical, we can't do that. Anything that in flows right back out. I don't have any extra thing. Or it flows in and its opposite flows in, and the two do nothing but stress the system. They won't do any work in the load. In other words, there will be no net field. There'll be two opposite and equal fields that are free.
That's symmetrical.
That's symmetrical. That's what Lorentz did. He made the theory symmetrical because those equations are much easier to solve. They didn't have computers. Numerical methods were a bear, and they still are if you have to do them longhand. Today, they're a piece of cake for a bright young grad student. He simply takes a Mathematica or something, slaps it in here, and the computer grinds out the answer any which way he wants it. That didn't exist back then. So there was a great need and urgency to make these equations easier to solve. So Lorentz made another change. It made them a lot easier to solve. And guess what he did? He threw out all the over-unity systems powered from the vacuum. In one stroke of the pen, to make the equations more beautiful and easier to solve, completely unwittingly, in a from the vacuum. In one stroke of the pen, to make the equations more beautiful and easier to solve, completely unwittingly, he threw out all the future systems that could have been built, taking energy from the active vacuum or from curved space-time or both. He discarded them with one stroke of the pen. And today, in every university, Maxwell's equations, that is, the Heaviside equations, have this extra added attraction of being Lorentz regauged, symmetrically regauged. Now, what does that do in a circuit? In a circuit, you've said, this circuit is going to have a forward EMF, that's that force, you see, and this back EMF are going to be equal. We're going to guarantee that circuit is equal in the forces. So there's no free force around there anywhere for you to use for free.
And yet Maxwell's original equation
system, then that circuit would have been built, taking energy from the active vacuum or from curved space-time or both. He discarded them with one stroke of the pen. And today, in every university, Maxwell's equations, that is, the Heaviside equations, have this extra added attraction of being Lorentz regauged, symmetrically regauged. Now, what does that do in a circuit? In a circuit, you've said, this circuit is going to have a forward EMF, that's that force, you see, and this back EMF are going to be equal. We're going to guarantee that circuit is equal in the forces. So there's no free force around there anywhere for you to use for free.
and yet Maxwell's original equations
Maxwell's original equations allowed that.
It was is this the area where they said it had no physical
Significance, no.
yeah, no physical significance.
The extra wind was of no.
Yes, the basis for being so shy on the potentials was that people thought they had no physical significance. They honestly believed that. It's only since quantum mechanics got born and so forth that we've gone back and found out that potentials are what's primary, and the force fields are effects made by the interactions of something that's a specially shaped potential that interacts with matter. The force field is not primary at all, but you see, still in our text, it's treated as the primary thing, particularly in electrodynamics and electrical engineering. But after this Lorentz regauging, you still had a problem. The problem is, if you built your circuit physically where it would comply with that equation, that symmetrically regauged equation, then that circuit would not go over unity. But suppose you didn't build your circuit that way. Then, foolish person that you are, your circuit will act up. It will do all kinds of weird things. And it may, in fact, put out more energy than you're putting in. It's taking the energy right out of the vacuum. It has a net extra force. It will do net extra work for free for you in the load. That would be nice, but it's ugly. It's not symmetrical. So it has to be destroyed. Well, they did destroy it, and what circuit has circuit physically where it would, in a circuit you've said, this circuit is going to have a forward EMF, that's that force, you see, and this back EMF are going to be equal. We're going to guarantee you that circuit is equal in the forces. So there's no free force around there anywhere for you to use for free.
And yet Maxwell's original equations that
Maxwell's original equations allowed that.
it was is this the area where they said it had no physical
Significance, no.
yeah, no physical significance?
The extra wind was of no.
Yes, the basis for being so shy on the potentials was that, you know, people thought they had no physical significance. They honestly believed that. It's only since quantum mechanics got born and so forth that we've gone back and found out that potentials are what's primary, and the force fields are effects made by the interactions of something that's a specially shaped potential that interacts with matter. The force field is not primary at all, but you see, still in our text, it's treated as the primary thing, particularly in electrodynamics and electrical engineering. But after this Lorentz regauging, you still had a problem. The problem is, if you built your circuit physically where it would comply with that equation, that symmetrically regauged equation, then that circuit would not go over unity. But suppose you didn't build your circuit that way. Then, foolish person that you are, your circuit will act up. It will do all kinds of weird things. And it may, in fact, put out more energy than you're putting in. It's taking the energy right out of the vacuum. It has a net extra force. It will do net extra work for free for you in the load. That would be nice, but it's ugly. It's not symmetrical. So it has to be destroyed. Well, they did destroy it, and what you have to ensure, this is totally unintentional now, unwitting. They all went to the simplest circuit that eliminated all those crazy problems most of the time. And guess what that is? A well-grounded, closed current loop circuit with the external source wired into the circuit as a load. Now let's reason together.
Symmetrical.
Circuit has being so shy on the potentials was that, you know, people thought they had no physical significance. They honestly believed that. It's only since quantum mechanics got born and so forth that we've gone back and found out that potentials are what's primary, and the force fields are effects made by the interactions of something that's a specially shaped potential that interacts with matter. The force field is not primary at all, but you see, still in our text, it's treated as the primary thing, particularly in electrodynamics and electrical engineering. But after this Lorentz regauging, you still had a problem. The problem is, if you built your circuit physically where it would comply with that equation, that symmetrically regauged equation, then that circuit would not go over unity. But suppose you didn't build your circuit that way. Then, foolish person that you are, your circuit will act up. It will do all kinds of weird things. And it may, in fact, put out more energy than you're putting in. It's taking the energy right out of the vacuum. It has a net extra force. It will do net extra work for free for you in the load. That would be nice, but it's ugly. It's not symmetrical. So it has to be destroyed. Well, they did destroy it, and what you have to ensure, this is totally unintentional now, unwitting. They all went to the simplest circuit that eliminated all those crazy problems most of the time. And guess what that is? A well-grounded, closed current loop circuit with the external source wired into the circuit as a load. Now let's reason together. Let's go back to the generator. I have a source of energy, and let's don't worry about the source right now. Coming out of the terminals of this generator, there's a flow of energy coming out of here. Okay. The voltage from the top to the bottom of the generator is a certain voltage. The voltage all the way around through the external circuit to that same point, given perfect conductors and all that, is in fact the same voltage. The field, the electric field all the way around through that whole circuit back to that point is exactly the opposite of the electric field that we call the back EMF between the terminals. That silly circuit has made the forward EMF and the back EMF, that is the two fields that we get for free when we introduce potential to the circuit and change its energy. It's made the two fields that we get equal and opposite. It self-enforces Lorentz symmetrical regauging, thereby guaranteeing that that silly circuit will never produce more energy out in the load than you got to put in the shaft of your generator.
So if you build a circuit that follows different rules, it has been called unexplained.
That's correct.
But in fact, it was explained
That's correct.
earlier in time.
If you want to work in this field, it's not yet a field, the field of taking energy from the vacuum and getting a net force field in your circuit to give you some free work in your load, if you want to follow this field and do well, your first requirement is to violate the standard closed current loop circuit. Until you do that, you cannot ever go over unity. Now, isn't it interesting that 85 or 90% of the people working in the so-called over unity field will come in and guess what? They will wire up a closed current loop circuit. They will guarantee self-enforced symmetrical regauging and their system will never work. And you can hand them an operating system that isn't wired that way, and they will say, this foolish fellow doesn't even know how to ground a system or how to build a proper closed current loop circuit. And so they will correct it. And that system will no longer perform because it's now a symmetrically regauged system. It will no longer give you more energy out than you're putting in. Regardless of how much free energy it takes in, it will use half of it to destroy the source. The other half, it'll spill some in the losses in the system. You'll get less than half out in the load. If you had a 100% efficient generator, didn't lose anything in the generator, no such generator exists, but if you did have one, you would have to put back in shaft horsepower exactly as much energy as was used to destroy the dipolarity of the generator. So you would have to put in that half that was used to destroy the generator. If it's less efficient than 100%, you have to put in more. That's automatically more than you're getting out in the load. So that circuit will never allow you to go over unity. You will always have less going out in the load than you got to put into the shaft of the generator.
So
That's not the way to build a power system.
And it's not also dependent upon, you have mentioned things like thin film, newer technology, but it's not really the newness of the technology. You could use traditional inductors and capacitors to create an over unity condition.
The old guys did. They didn't even have semiconductors. They didn't have all these other things. Tesla didn't have any of that. He made over unity systems. Stubblefield certainly didn't have any of that. He made over unity systems. And the point is to break up the symmetry. Because today we know in modern physics, once we say broken symmetry, Lee says it very gently, Nobelist Lee. He says, something virtual has become observable. In other words, you get some virtual energy out of the vacuum and you convert it and change it and compress it into observable, real energy you can use.
Right.
But in the overall schema of nature, this symmetrical regauging only takes place artificially in the electrodynamic world. Doesn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Nature is full of systems that are we owe our life to it. The sun radiates energy, which makes the biosphere here on Earth possible. There's continuous input of energy. If you were to take that away, so for example, vanish the sun, just black it out, everything here on this Earth would die. It depends on a steady input of free energy that we don't pay for. You don't have to pay for the sun. If you did, we'd be hard put to manage it. But everything that we know of depends on this steady input of energy. Nature freely exchanges energy energy transfer costs nothing. It's not work. Work rigorously is when you change the form of some energy into a different form. Then you do work. If you just want to change the magnitude of some energy and you flow in the energy in the same form, costs you nothing except you got to have a line to flow it in on. But you don't pay for the energy to build up any amount you wish. Energy always occurs in a flow. That was the beauty of Whittaker's work in 1903 and 1904. He took what we call a potential and what we call fields and things like that and decomposed them and showed they are made of energy flows. And that's rigorous work. His second paper started a whole subject called superpotential theory. Unfortunately, they continued to ignore his first paper, which gave them an internal electrodynamics much more fundamental than the external stuff we use. So the internal structuring we just continue to ignore. We only look at the brute force fields and the brute force potentials.
Was it Whittaker that initiated the energy flow through space theory?
No. That was originated by two men. Energy flow through space did not exist in Maxwell's day, before Maxwell's death. The concept of energy flow through circuits, through space, all this stuff, originated with two fellows. One, John Poynting, and the other, Oliver Heaviside. Now, Poynting is an academician, PhD, well-known scholar, and so forth. Heaviside is publishing in more obscure publications than the Proceedings of the Royal Society. He later got some in there. But most of his publications, lots of them, were in a thing called The Electrician, which was something like Scientific American today would be. That's a close parallel to what it was. And Heaviside was always publishing things that had direct practical utility to how to wire a transformer, how to fix transformers on lines and make everything efficient and so forth. So a lot of his work had very practical applications. Some of it was also very theoretical, like the Heaviside functions he created. The mathematicians hated him. They criticized him and attacked him and said, you know, this dirty guy doesn't even know how to do good mathematics. And later, a real famous mathematician came in and said, he does too, because that's beautiful stuff if you understand this part. And finally they said, oh, okay, we'll take it. Nobody ever apologized to old Heaviside. But the point is, energy flow got born in the 1880s by Poynting and by Heaviside. Poynting never considered anything but the amount of energy that enters the wire from the circuit from outside. See, the energy flow is really on the outside of the wire. It doesn't flow through the wire at all. But a little bit of it gets diverged, we would say, into the wire. And that little bit forms all the fields inside the wire that push the electron through the load and power the load. So he only considered that vertical component that enters the wire. He considered that the flow of the energy. Well, you see, that's not the flow of the energy along the circuit. He got it wrong by 90 degrees. Heaviside corrected him, and Heaviside showed that you had this flow going along parallel, and only a tiny component gets diverted in there. Well, this was an embarrassment. First, they had to buy the Heaviside stuff was accurate, so they had to buy that. But it had a problem. Boy, did it have a problem, and it's still got a problem today. The amount of the energy flow that's going outside the wire, coming out of the terminals of the generator, that's diverted into the circuit and powers the circuit is only a tiny bit of the actual energy flow going on. Let's use a number. I looked at a couple of circuits, and the best that I could estimate, very simple ones, the best that I could estimate it The rest of the energy remaining after the part gets diverged, the part that doesn't get diverged, that's divergence free, is about 10 trillion times as much as gets diverged. What if we said, if you don't like the figure 10 trillion, take a billion. It's a large number. What do we make of a generator that we put so much mechanical energy into, and this cotton picking thing is pouring out 1 billion times as much energy as we put in cranking the shaft? Where does the energy come from? Embarrassing. Because nobody had the foggiest notion, neither Heaviside or anybody else. It was so bad to try to keep from being accused of a dirty old perpetual motion fellow and advocate violating conservation of energy and creating energy. He only spoke obliquely of the directions of the energy flow. But he did get across that the energy flow remaining that didn't get diverted was far larger than the part that goes in our circuits and we use.
And whose formulas were defining this 10 trillion times more energy?
It's never been worked out exactly that I can find. It may be in Heaviside stuff somewhere. I haven't read every paper he wrote. But Heaviside did understand it was enormously bigger than the part that got diverged, because he says so. That tiny amount that gets diverged is responsible for power in the circuit. And he left it at that, so he wouldn't be accused of being an idiot.
But it's in Krauss's, it's memorialized in today's theory, isn't it? I mean, it's a common, that doesn't Krauss's electrodynamics book?
No, he shows the flow outside there, but he doesn't show the Heaviside component. He implies that all that gets diverged. It doesn't. So now we come to Lorentz, the greatest scientist of his day at this time. We're up into Lorentz's day now. Lorentz looks at that. He well understands Heaviside's work. He well understands Poynting's work. But he hasn't got the foggiest notion what on earth could possibly be a source for all that enormous energy that didn't get diverged in the circuit. Since it's divergent free, it means it's in a curl form and it doesn't interact with anything. It goes out and normally doesn't interact with you, with the environment, or anything very much at all. Just usually gets just wasted. But it's there. So a problem that Lorentz was facing was, we have this irresolvable problem. What do you do with it? First of all, even the great Lorentz, if he had said publicly and clearly, there is enormous energy flowing from every power source, far, far greater than we ever catch in the circuit and use, including, even billions of times greater, why, he would have been tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail, so to speak, by the scientific community, as advocating creation of energy from nothing. Well, if you can't solve the problem, scientifically you can do another thing. You can eliminate the problem. Get rid of it, so it's not bothering you anymore or anybody else. But to get rid of it, you've got to have a very smooth, elegant statement that just slides so pretty, just like silk candy. It slides right through the mind and doesn't stir anything. Everybody just accepts it right on. So what Lorentz did is he originated a clever little integration trick. He visualized around any point in the circuit, any point you want to take, you must visualize a closed surface around it. Now, understand energy flow is going in this surface, coming out the other surface. A little tiny bit of it is being diverged inside here into the circuit. So a little bit less is coming out than is going in. But if you integrate the energy flow vector itself that represents energy flow around that closed loop circuit, what it will neatly do, the parts that go through and don't get diverged, it'll subtract them. One's positive, let's say, going in, is negative going out. They go to zero. It only leaves a little component that goes in and gets diverged into the circuit. And what you do is you say a very clever statement that Lorentz came up and says, this other component, this Heaviside component, has no physical significance because it doesn't do anything. It won't interact with anything, so it has no physical significance. Doesn't that sound smooth? So It's exactly what he taught everybody to do, and once you did that, the problem went away. All you have is the amount of energy goes in the circuit. Half of that now goes back to kill your source. Less than half is going to get in your load. Now you're down home free with an under unity circuit. Everybody's happy. And meanwhile, every generator you ever built and every battery that you ever got out of the battery store puts out enough energy flow to power the whole continental United States. Could you catch it and use it? But you're not permitted to know that anymore. And if you find out about it, you will be laughed at and it will be called ludicrous, but it is a fact. Now, can we prove that? Yes, we can. Fortunately, we can. The only way that it stays non-divergent is to stay in a flat space-time condition or reasonably so. If I have something that will curve space-time a little bit, all of a sudden the divergence of a curl is not zero. Mathematically, you just blew vector analysis out the window because you got to go to tensors once you get curvature space-time. You can't stay down in those vectors in flat space-time. You got to allow for the curved space-time. You got to bring in general relativity. And what had been a zero mathematical operation is no longer zero. This means that you can catch some of that extra energy, at least a little bit of it, and you can use it. And there's an area in physics which does it, and they never discuss thermodynamics. It's called negative resonance absorption of the medium. A little charge exposed to potential or field or energy input to it has a certain what we call reaction cross-section. Look at it like a rock in a river. It'll divert so much of the stream around it. But if the rock is not fixed, if it goes into violent oscillation, it'll disturb lots more water around it. It'll collect lots more energy. So when the particle, a charged particle, is chosen, which at the frequency of the energy I'm feeding into it, it goes into self-resonance. It will collect in the ultraviolet or the infrared, if I arrange things correctly, 18 times as much energy as I calculate I'm putting in for any collection on a static rock, which is the way electrodynamics is written in the model, for static matter. It will collect 18 times as much energy that you don't think you put in, and your numbers that you crank out of the Poynting energy flow say was never put into the circuit. And you'll have articles that say, how can a particle absorb more than the energy impinging on it? And blah, 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 blah about how it does that. Basically, it takes the energy out of the vacuum because the other energy was there in the vacuum all the time in that special Heaviside form. What you really did was prove Heaviside was right. And there is enormous energy in the Heaviside component for us to get and use if we will turn loose the sharp young grad students and the sharp young postdocs and fund them and let them go get it. Department of Energy, are you listening? One generator, one massive plant that you build and put in or administer, could power the entire United States if you would go catch the energy you're wasting. You don't have to destroy the biosphere and burn all the oil and all the coal and all that if you'll do some science that Heaviside did before the turn of the century. And that's a century ago. So over 100 years old we're talking about. It's been ignored. It's time to pay some attention to it. Anyway, you can catch it. We tried to point out that if you used a Heaviside processor and you didn't get the 18, you only got 10, let's say, because of a lot of losses. If you put a thing that would absorb the heat that you make from burning the coal in a standard plant before you get it to the boiler, and let it do a 10-to-1 amplification for you by taking the energy out of the vacuum with that process that's already in physics, you could eliminate 90% of the coal burning right there with one change to your present generators, plants.
Interesting.
Why aren't we looking at things like that? National Science Foundation, you put out a big study in 2000 saying, well, our job is to look at innovative things. Why aren't you doing that? Why are you still talking about how I can burn some coal a little bit cleaner or how I can burn the oil a little bit more efficiently?
Well, because it was excised from our system, our education.
It's been excised from the system, and therefore it's not a matter of intent. It's unwitting.
Yeah.
It's an unwitting negligence by the whole scientific community. But it's in the literature. It's sitting there waiting anytime anybody wants to pick it up and run with it. I didn't originate it, Heaviside did. And Lorentz couldn't solve the problem, so we got rid of it. And everybody else can't solve the problem either. They don't even want to look at it. They grab what Lorentz did, and they're all taught to do the same integration and use the same set of words. It has no physical significance. We can show you that in Jackson's book and several other books.
Well, it's like you've already said, the particle physicists are not going over walking
That's
across
correct.
the campus to the.
That's right. So we have things sitting in our literature which, if followed up, would solve the energy crisis forever and could be done fairly quickly, some of them, and nobody is paying any attention.
Well,
It's a problem in our system. It's a problem in our scientific system because don't blame Bush and Cheney. Where do they get their advice? They get it from our scientific community. And our scientists tell them absolutely honestly with everything they know and with their heart in it. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, you can't do anything else. We don't know anything else you can do.
Well, and their General Electric sponsored funding.
That's correct.
That doesn't hurt their point of view either.
You control, science got controlled, you see, because you control science by controlling its funding and how it's spent. The PhD sitting out here in the local university does not have control of the research he's going to do. Sorry about that. Two things, he has to publish papers and get them published, so he's got to go through peer review. He can't get too innovative or he'll get tarred and feathered. Run out of his position and be lucky if he can work at the local fast food store. He's got a problem that the university is on his back to bring in extra money from outside. If he doesn't, he's not considered worth his salt. At best, they'll park him somewhere teaching sophomore something or freshman something, and that's it. He's got to have extra funding also to pay his grad students for their doctoral programs and also to his postdocs. So his problem turns down primarily to be, I've got to have extra funding, and the funding comes down in packages with the research already prescribed that you're going to do. Already laid out and told what you're going to do. He has to bid on these packages and he has to win some of them, or pretty soon he's either on his way out, or if he's got tenure, he winds up being the sophomore instructor and that's it.
I want to talk a little bit about energy flow through space in a manner that you have before in terms of the pipe and the river and what goes through the pipe and what's flowing around the pipe.
When we talk about energy, we get into, and we talk about it in the fuller sense, not like we're using it presently in electrical engineering, but when we also talk about it in the larger sense, where we bring in the general relativity and we bring in the particle physics. And we look at those interactions, which are always going on, they always generate forces. We've just found how to sweep them out and not have to pay attention to them in normal engineering. But we paid a bit of price for doing that, for making it simpler, because we eliminated our ability to get the energy out for free or almost for free. And so we've had to pollute the biosphere and everything, have ever more energy to burn more coal, burn more oil, whatever. We don't have to do it that way at all. We can burn a lot less of all of that stuff, far, far less than what we're doing now, if we would but work the problem. So, but when we get into energy, we find that we have positive energy and negative energy. In a vacuum, since Dirac's theory and modern physics, modern particle physics since then, we understand that the vacuum is full of little virtual particles bubbling everywhere. Incredible energy. You can also represent it as a set of holes, each filled with if you don't like the bubbles so much. And each of these holes is filled with its corresponding particle. For example, like an electron. There's a hole here that's exactly will hold an electron. And once a real electron falls in there, the hole is full. The vacuum is what we would call empty space at that time, with the hole filled. Another electron coming in doesn't have a hole to fall into because it's already full. Right. But if you put some energy in here, you can pop this electron out of here and leave the hole. And if you're clever, you can take the electrons that you got for free out of this process, well, for the energy you paid, you can go use them. You can also use these holes, but that's negative energy. Now, the way they use negative energy at present, they assume it's already interacted with mass somewhere, swallowed another electron and left an excess positive charge, which then is a positron, a lattice positron. All the solid state people use lattice positrons.
Okay.
As long as it has not interacted with matter, the Dirac hole is not a positron. It's a negative energy electron. And it has negative mass. And you can hold it in that state without being filled for a short time, at least in circuits. When you do, acting as a source charge, it's producing at the speed of light negative energy photons, which are establishing negative energy fields and potentials from it. So you can have a flow of negative EM energy along a circuit as opposed to positive energy that we have in our textbooks, if you trick it just right. Okay, what is the useful part of that? Let's talk about the function of a circuit when energy flow is flowing along it. Positive energy is divergent. And remember, pointing only got the diverged part that comes into the circuit. It's the divergent energy. It's always trying to diverge from its line of flow and escape back to the environment. It's trying to get away from where you want it to go. So what we call conductivity, like in a conductor, is the characteristic of that conductor to be a waveguide, to prevent that escape of positive energy and hold it along its path. So if I have perfect conductivity, I don't have any loss. The energy is forced to hold in place and gets across to the other side. I get just as much out as I put in. But normal circuits are not pure conductors. We have impedances. Even in the wire, we have a little impedance. So what we have is we have an impedance that is met along the path. An impedance, by definition, is a small reduction, at least some reduction in your conductivity. That is, it reduces the ability of that wire to be a waveguide and hold that energy along it. So some of the energy escapes and leaks off. And we call that losses in the circuits. So for positive energy, I put some in at the beginning. I have my impedances. Certainly if I got a load, I've got impedances. But I've got impedances in the way my circuit is made anyway, and I'm losing some all the time. So I'm going to get less out there in that load to power it than I put in. It's the leaky diode, leaky pipe. The pipe carrying the energy to the load leaked all the way, and I didn't get as much over to the load as I put in. Sorry, I'm under unity, particularly since I got it in a closed current loop circuit and I'm killing my power source with the other half all the time. But negative energy is nature's beneficial grant to humankind and to the world. Negative energy works exactly backwards. It's the convergent energy. It's the energy that the environment is always trying to pour into any flow of negative energy going along a conducting path. The environment is trying to put more negative energy in there all the time, free. You don't have to pay a thing for it. It's trying desperately to do that. Conductivity now is still the process of preventing change and of doing that waveguide and preventing any change. So the negative energy flowing, well, the conductivity will not allow any excess energy to flow in there. And so in this pipe, I will now get out a pure conductor. At the other end, I'll get exactly what I put in, just like I did with positive energy. But again, it's not a perfect world, and the circuits are not perfect conductors. There are impedances. But now when I meet an impedance, what it does reduces the conductivity, reduce the wave guiding, which means some excess energy now crowds in here and converges in here, negative energy. Coming past that impedance, I have more than I'm putting in. The next impedance, I get some more. So if I have a series of impedance, by the time I get to the end of the flow, I have enormously more flow than I'm putting in. 10, 15, 20 times more in a common circuit. Maybe 100 if you really do things real fine. So I have lots more negative energy coming out than what I'm putting in on the other side. I didn't create any energy. Nature kindly gave that to me because she said, oh great, you allowed me some impedance where I can give you the energy. And I'm happy to do that. Here it is to you for free. And you say, well, we got to have positive energy to run loads. Well, we do with the way we design them. We could design them to use negative energy, but nobody's ever thought of it. Nobody's ever developed negative energy flows, except one fellow named Bedini. And so nobody has paid any attention to using circuits in the negative energy role. rather than a positive energy role.
Well, you had mentioned yesterday that Sweet's circuit had.
Sweet's circuit produced more negative energy than positive by far in his device.
And Gray also.
Gray, splitting the positive, yes, he was dealing with some negative energy. If you really got the kind of motors you're making today, which demand positive energy, all you got to do to convert negative energy to positive energy is invert the terminals of a capacitor and charge it. Negative charges backwards from positive energy. And then take the capacitor, charge real quick, by the way, and turn it around and connect it back onto your load, and it'll discharge normal garden variety positive energy and run the load. So it's something that can be done in every circuit.
What's an example of a negative energy generator?
Only something built by Padini that I know of is doing that right now. The Sweet device, its output was more, anytime you have a system taking energy from the vacuum and producing more out than in, obviously you have to involve some negative energy, or you wouldn't get out more than you put in. You've gone into the use of some fraction of your system in the negative energy mode, where you understand it or not. But since we don't build over unity systems, we don't have any phenomenology in our textbooks.
So in other words, in something like Sweet's device, he had to have been creating those holes
Yes,
in order to, which is the definition.
but you see, you create them normally. Anytime you pulse things or make gradients or anything, you create holes all the time in every circuit. It's churning around. It's never just a steady vacuum that's going on. You're interacting on that vacuum, and it's interacting back on you in that circuit all the time. We just don't allow for it in normal electrical engineering. But particle physics can tell you that's happening. It's already in the physics book. It's just not over in the electrical engineering book.
How is Wu's work influential in this?
Well, the Wu's work had to do with Li and Yang's prediction, and starting particularly in 1956 and early 57, of broken symmetry. Remember, everybody was worshiping symmetry. And all of a sudden, broken symmetry comes out of Li and Yang as being a major thing. You cannot avoid it. Well, this was overwhelming. This was such a revolution that, were it true, it would revolutionize all of physics, which it did. But what I'm saying is that all the other scientists immediately, the experimental scientists immediately jumped on that to see if that was true or not. Because if it was true, it was in fact a revolution.
So their focus was broken symmetry, or,
Yes.
or asymmetrical systems.
That's right. And so Wu and her colleagues very quickly proved that it was real, experimentally. And they did that in February 1957. This is how fast a time frame this thing occurred. So we got the main work done just in 56 and early 57. By early 57, Wu has just proven it experimentally already. And the Nobel Prize Committee looked at that, and they moved with absolute incredible speed, and in December of the same year, 1957, awarded the Nobel Prize to Li and Yang. Because it did create a tremendous revolution in all of physics. In the nearly half a century since then, it hasn't migrated from the physics department over to the electrical engineering department and got them to change their model.
Give us the simplest explanation you can of how they demonstrated broken symmetry and how they defined it.
Well, that's their experiments were pretty complex because they were dealing with nuclear particle physics, you see. And so they did particle physics experiments, very intricate, but ones where you had equipment and techniques already worked out to measure exactly what was going on. And the measurements showed very clearly it's broken symmetry. And by the way, what's of interest to such great interest to electromagnetics and electrical engineering, one of the primary broken symmetries of nature is a dipole. Just separate a positive and a negative charge and just hold them there, leave them, just park them. You know, nail them down and leave them alone. Don't bother them. And they will radiate energy they take from the vacuum, convert it, and radiate real, honest-to-God electromagnetic energy from now till the end of time, or until you allow them to be destroyed. If you will just make a dipolarity and let it alone and not destroy it, it will take energy from the vacuum from now on and radiate it forever. That's where Heaviside's component was coming from. Once we had a dipolar generator, it's not what I'm putting in the shaft. It has anything to do with that. It's what that dipole is receiving from the vacuum and pouring out. And what it means is it's receiving one heck of a lot and pouring out a heck of a lot more than is in any of our electrical engineering books.
What's an example of an undisturbed dipole?
A permanent magnet.
Okay.
Magnetic charge is what we call a pole. And so a permanent magnet sits there and it pours out photons all the time that continually replenish its magnetic field that's traveling all the time outside there. It's not a static field at all, that's false. Rigorously, it's a non-equilibrium system, steady state. It's receiving the energy from the vacuum at a steady rate, transforming it to real energy at a steady rate, pouring it out at a steady rate. At any one point, I'll use Van Flanderen's analogy because it's beautiful. It's like a waterfall, a perfect waterfall. Every molecule of water is moving on, but it's always replaced by a molecule coming along behind. So overall, the waterfall would appear static, a beautiful form. It's not. It's completely dynamic. Every part's in motion. The same thing is true with a field. The overall field may appear static, but every photon in it is in motion at the speed of light all the time.
So a permanent magnet will stay in a dipole state indefinitely.
That's correct.
How about the battery that you buy from the supermarket?
Sure. If you didn't come back in and kick it in the rear with and fight your back EMF across it and send that current back through the battery the wrong way and knock the dipole apart, it would last far longer until something actually corroded.
But just sitting the battery there on the table.
It's radiating energy all the time. But the energy you see, you're not collecting it, you're not wiring it into a load, and the only way we've been taught to collect it is let it to flow, go in the circuit, and the circuit start using half of that collected energy to destroy the battery dipolarity. That's giving it the energy from the vacuum. The other half gets lost in the circuit's losses, and then you use it in the load. So I get less in the load that I'm using to destroy my battery. And by the way, if you use negative energy, you can charge batteries with enormous rates. For example, take the number 300 kilowatt peak power pulse. If you strike a common lead acid storage battery, say a 12-volt battery, with 300 kilowatts peak power pulse, you will explode that battery violently and blow the back end of your laboratory out with positive energy. If you strike that same battery with 300 kilowatts peak power pulse of negative energy, the battery loves it. You may get rid of some sulfation and restore a lot of the battery that's been corroded and so forth, but the battery loves it and charges just tremendously. You have no risk of explosion or anything like that. So negative energy does have some advantages. It's not trying to explode everything outward. It's trying to converge it in. Things will stand a lot more compression than they will explosion. So negative energy has lots of nice beneficial uses. One of it is it also cools rather than heats. Explosive stuff heats, convergent stuff cools. So the future is going to be involved in the use of negative energy, the use of the heaviside component we've ignored for over 100 years and we can prove is real, and in negative energy engineering, which is negative entropy engineering. We don't have to heat up the whole biosphere and heat the rivers and all with our exhaust river flows and all. We don't have to do that all to get the energy from the vacuum. We have to do that if we use the present engineering and science we are applying. If we change the science to what's available and develop it, we do not have to do that. We can take all the energy we want from any point in the universe. Every battery sitting on the shelf, 12-volt battery, and every generator sitting in the plant already produces enough energy, if you count the heaviside component, to power the United States. We just haven't bothered to learn how to use it. We keep throwing that big component away and pretending it's not there.
If somebody came to you, if the academic ruler of the world came to you and said, okay, Tom, we're ready. We want to start putting this into practice. We want to start going down this road.
Fine. Let him set up some funding programs and let him set up some grad students. We have some sharp PhDs who would work this area.
On a practical level, what would be the step-by-step process that you would recommend? Not the infrastructural aspect of funding and all that, the organizational part, but practically, what should people start looking towards or looking at? What kinds of experiments? Coils, semiconductors, magnetics, You know, where should people start looking to really? Where's
Well, you see, you have
what's the
me
jumping
at a
off point?
disadvantage now because I'm an inventor and I work with inventors and I work under non-disclosure agreements. So I can't sit here and tell you what Bedini does in his circuits. All I can do is tell you he does it, and he's filed a patent application on it. But it is working on the bench. Now, there's two ways the technology gets born. There's a conventional wisdom way that says you first go through all the scientific community and you do this and you do that, and gradually over a period of time you finally develop it and there you are. Some is done that way. Most is not. Most of it is done because some crazy fellow sitting somewhere that's wired up different in his neurons or something is noticing some effects on the bench in front of him, and he keeps picking and he keeps playing and he keeps adjusting until he finally finds an effect that's giving him something he really could use. That's called inventing. And most of this has been discoveries made, the original discoveries were made this way. Then the theorists come along and see these effects which don't fit the textbook. The theorist comes along and says, boy, that's interesting. And I'm looking for something that's not the old hat. I need something new to look at to try to explain. And once the theorists get in, when you get enough of them in there, you'll finally get the right fellow that can figure out how it's working. And at that point, you now have a theoretical model that describes it accurately enough, and you have some working experiments that show the effect is really there. And now you have the beginning of developing a science. You've got to reach that point. I must have the experiments that show something, and I must also have had enough theoretical work done to have a pretty good model, at least a reasonably accurate model to describe it and understand it. Then we can do science from here on. We can develop technology, we can develop science, we can develop instruments to measure all kinds of stuff. We can't do that until we understand something about the behavior pretty well, and until we have some effects that are actually working that we can replicate and show it's doing. Today's particle physics and higher group symmetry, electrodynamics like that, have come along far enough that today there is enough physics to put together the model. But it's in bits and pieces in all the parts of physics. It's not put together as a comprehensive model. This is a job that has to be done. Within my own personal limitations, what I've been doing is gathering the bits and pieces and trying to put them together into something that shows the whole, with the idea that then the theoreticians can come along, the real heavy horsepower, or what we call heavy hitter theorists can come along and put the whole thing together, and we'll finally have a theory that applies to taking the energy directly from the vacuum in all its aspects and using it. We'll have development of instruments which do the measurement. You know how hard it is to measure negative energy? A little bit difficult. And so solid state stuff really doesn't like negative energy. It prefers that that's already interacted with matter and produced positrons. It doesn't want to see holes. It wants to see positrons.
The measuring devices.
The measuring devices do. So they are not equipped to deal with actual holes that have not yet formed positrons or resulted in positrons. So there are many things that the inventor, for example, is struggling with. And what he does is he works out certain procedures that he finds works. Because all he's got is his discovery. Once he makes enough discoveries to where he can file a patent on this area, he has to file a patent before he has any rights at all, anything of any commercial value. He doesn't have anything worth 1 cent until he files the patent. Now, let's reason together. I'm a writer, and if I write something and it's copyrighted, the copyright is good for my life plus 50 or 75 years or something like that, and every once in a while they change it even more, to make it more lucrative to me. If I'm an inventor and I file the patent on my intellectual discovery and property, I'm doing good to get 20 years out of it. When I get through fighting it through the patent office and all, maybe I'll get 18 years out of it. And that's it. At that point, anybody in the world can take it and build it, and I have no royalties or anything. So the inventor has a real problem. He's fighting the problem where he has to get to the patent stage. He has to file the patent. Hopefully he's got to fight now till he gets the patent. And then he has got to turn around and he's got to go seek venture capital funding. because he didn't have any funding. His problem is, how can I do that? If he has been very, very successful and he's got this thing already developed to a real big system ready to go and, you know, eye-opening flashing lights and everything all over, in other words, he's done all the development work somehow, he can do it by licensing. If he has not gotten to that stage, he can do it two ways. He can do it the way where he finds an independent capitalist who will fund it, venture capitalists, usually taking a tremendous chunk of it, and usually taking over total control of it, and there can be disaster, because they'll put normal engineers in charge of it if you're not careful. Or he can also form his own company and sell stock in the company and things like that. That is both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is it is legal to, if you don't overstate what you have and you state that you're in development on this, it is legal to sell stock and this kind of thing. On the other hand, that provides a wonderful opportunity for guys who are really con artists, who really don't care whether they got something that works, as long as they got something they can fool you with, and as long as they can keep getting money from naive investors.
Well, if you're working with technology that doesn't have a worked out set of proofs, it makes it very easy to be a
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Nobody's got any backdrop to say yay or nay.
That's correct. So we're in an area now where the orthodox scientific community, because of its long experience with symmetrically regauged systems, is going to tell you this is impossible. They've never thought that any electrical power system takes any of its energy from the vacuum. They have no idea of that at all. Takes it from the shaft horsepower you're putting in, which is totally false. Nonetheless, that's the accepted answer. So their answer from the official established scientific community is you cannot do that. But that's always been the answer of the scientific community. Anything highly innovative, just look at history. So the problem we have is, how do we now, with the way science is now controlled, in the old days, the PhDs had some control over how they spent their research funds. They don't anymore. And they're under much more pressure to publish or perish and to get extra money coming in. They've been turned into a money grubbing operation, not pure scientific endeavor. Postdocs are caught to say what most postdocs wander around after that trying to find a career and where to work and all, and many of them, half of them never find a real solid, steady working place. They just drift from here to drift to there. We don't use our scientists very well at all under this new system where we already package everything and nobody's allowed to do any innovation. But it's good for control, and it's good for the folks that are up on top, because they ruthlessly control any innovation that would reduce their position or their influence. So we have a human situation which is tightened up to control and keep this kind of thing completely out of science, because they control the PhDs, they control the research they're allowed to do, the packages they have to bid on, and they control what programs those young graduate students can work on for their doctorates and what they can work on for their postdoctoral programs. So they've got it locked up in a box. Okay, we go back to the inventor side then. Since we got a locked up scientific community until we blast it open from the inventor side, the inventor's got the problem that now he's got the whole, it's not like I have a better gadget. There's a gadget already known and I have an improvement on this gadget that you could understand the commercial value of. Now I have a system which the entire scientific community tells you is false. This cannot be done. They tell you this inventor is either a charlatan or else he's just commonly mistaken. They will give you that benefit of the doubt. But there's no room for anything else in their textbook. So the problem is, how do we now restore innovation when we got a real good system that's shutting it out? Everybody uses that buzzword. Everybody talks about thinking out of the box. But when the funding comes down, they don't want to fund it. We have somehow got to pop loose a part of the scientific community, its funding and everything else, which is charged with a motto that thou shalt never work on anything ordinary. Until we have an agency and a group who's charged with doing that, we cannot do innovative science. We've got to do one more thing. The inventor says, well, we've got all these laboratories, we've got all the national labs, we've got all this stuff. I'll try to work with one of them. That's the kiss of death. These fellows in the lab, if they write a paper, they cannot copyright it because they spent government, U.S. taxpayer dollars and U.S. taxpayer time to do that. It's already been paid for. It's in the open domain. But they are allowed to file patents. That is a serious mistake. The inventor is the stupidest person on this planet if he goes to a government agency trying to work with them. Because he's working with people who are his fierce competitors. They're looking for patents. Their prestige, their power, and everything depends on how many patents they can get, for one thing. So what they're going to do, if they learn what he's doing, they're going to change a few coils or something, and they're going to patent it, and you're going to have a tremendous Donnybrook. Yeah, you can sue them till you're blue in the face. If you've got a big company behind you and lots of financial power, you might win something. The odds are you won't win anything. Or you go to DARPA. A DARPA contract usually will have a nice little clause in it, particularly for inventors. It's called the government reserves march-in rights. What the devil is march-in rights? It's this. One bureaucrat writes one document that states, you are not getting, they funded the thing, you are not getting this thing to market fast enough to meet the government's needs. So the government exercises its march-in rights. It seizes your patent. It takes the whole program away from you, lock, stock, and barrel, takes it over to its favorite big contractor and has them put it out on the market and everything, and you're sitting out on the coal. Now, in theory, quote, unquote, if you sue them long enough, maybe you could get some compensation somewhere. Good luck, Charlie Brown. What you will find is you just lost your whole invention. So any inventor who knows this ball of wax is waiting on us out there is not going to do anything with the U.S. government. He's foolish if he does, under the situation at present. Now, if we would change that, where these cats can't do patents just like they can't do copyrights, then we would have something like a more fair shake. We would also have a great deal more innovation in our great national labs than we have right now, where everybody's struggling, in many cases, to be the big monkey. We've got to break that game up and get back to science and doing science, and that means innovative science. That means looking at what Heaviside found and what Lorentz then had us hide again, and go after that bit of energy that's free for the taking in everything we're producing anywhere.
This thing that you were mentioning about your objective is trying to put together sort of a synthesis of all of this information. You're not really trying to reinvent the wheel.
No.
Or come up with a new theory of special general relativity. You're just trying to reassemble, really, or complete assembling these components that are functional and practical and exist.
That's correct. What I do is I have been going for many years, starting back before we even had good computers or anything, and what I was having to do was go through the shelves and look, hour after hour after hour at the old journals way back. What I've been trying to do is find a few nuggets that allow you to put together from these nuggets already been discovered, already sitting on a shelf, nobody's ever done anything with, and put that together and see what now comes out of it when you have all this stuff that's been ignored. When you do, you start to see energy from the vacuum, things like this, things we could do if we really put centralized and heavy programs on it and good sharp people and good funding. There really are things sitting on the shelf that have been totally ignored, and not a thing has been done with it that we should have paid attention to a long time ago. So what I've been doing is collecting these pieces, the bits and pieces, to try to put them together as something resembling a whole and say, if we put these together properly, we do have a legitimate theory and can have a legitimate science of taking energy from the vacuum, and we can solve our energy crisis. Now, these other people who made these original discoveries made the discovery. I didn't build the Sweet device. Floyd Sweet did.
Right.
I didn't build Krone's original prototype of that.
Right.
Krone did, not Tom Bearden. I read about it. I tried to put the pieces together to see where they fit and what made them tick. And this is what we're trying to pass on to the young grad students so they don't have to spend maybe 30 years just looking for the nuggets. They can take the nugget, go back, and I give them the hard reference. They can go back and look at that reference themselves and say, make up their own mind. Does this say what he says it says, or does it not? Now, if they find I've made an error and all my pencils still need erasers, like everybody else's, change that thing and correct it and go on. But don't spend 30 years of your life just looking for the bits and pieces that are already on the shelf, just nobody ever integrated. Take that and make a science with it, solve this energy crisis, and do some great good for humanity, coming right out of the scientific community.
But in addition to that, in your experience, you have the added confirmation of observation of these inventions. That's the extra physical.
Yes, I have been very fortunate in that I have been able to work with several inventors who did have widgets that worked. Now, each inventor was a unique human being, and is today, those that are still alive. Howard Johnson built a permanent magnet motor that'll power itself and turn itself. And there is, in fact, a science of how that's done. Today, it's even in the literature. If you go to Feynman's 3 volumes of physics, and you find out about the exchange force, and they visualize a rotor and a stator magnet, and you visualize assemblies of magnets put together so that just as you are attracting in and you get to the payback time on the other side where you start to pull back, the force reverses on you, you got your back MMF. If during that period you suddenly emit a sharp pulse of exchange force, if you cause that to be triggered, you can override the back MMF and the system will drive right on through. And that system will self-rotate, and it obeys the conservation of energy law, and it obeys all the laws of physics. Violates the hell out of violates the second law of thermodynamics. Because the second law only applies to equilibrium when those forces are equal and opposite. It doesn't apply to the system when they're not.
Who wrote the second law of thermodynamics?
A whole bunch of people twisted around with it for about 100 years. And what they did is strictly for a system in equilibrium. It does not apply to systems out of equilibrium at all. Every time you apply voltage to a circuit, you break the equilibrium, you violate the second law of thermodynamics. It rigorously applies only to equilibrium systems. Check the textbook, a good one. So it also got over involved with the whole notion of entropy. All that entropy really means is energy the system formerly had in it that it had control of to use, that it no longer has control of. The energy didn't vanish. It's still there, but the system can't control it anymore. It may be out there in the environment. It went back to the environment. Escaped, got away. But the system has no control of it any longer. That is the production of entropy. Entropy is a measure of the energy that was controlled that's now uncontrolled and loose and can't be used. That's all it is. Now, negative energy is not a mystical thing. Anytime I get more energy into the system that now is available for my use and control, that is a negative energy operation. Potentializing a circuit is a negative entropy operation. Violates the heck out of equilibrium. Violates the second law automatically because it broke equilibrium. Equilibrium is the maximum entropy condition, standard thermo. Any departure from equilibrium automatically reduces the entropy, which is a negative entropy operation. Standard thermo, not Tom Bearden. So where did everybody get the idea you can't violate the second law of thermodynamics? It's the easiest thing on earth to violate. Piece of cake. Every windmill in the world is sitting there saying, the heck with you, second law, I'm going to operate in a non-equilibrium condition. Every solar power system, every hydroelectric power system is violating the heck out of the second law of thermodynamics. All prescribed in that part of thermodynamics that does non-equilibrium systems. But it certainly doesn't apply to equilibrium systems, and it has nothing to do with creating energy out of nothing. It's simply where something put the energy in. And then the only question is, did you have to put the energy in and pay for it, or did you trick nature to give it to you for free? The beauty of the windmill is nature gave it to me for free. It didn't pay for it. Now, that doesn't mean it's all economically free. I got to pay for the windmill, I got to pay for the maintenance, got to pay for the generator, I got to pay for the transmission lines, etc., etc. But I do not pay for the energy.
Hold on a second.
It's a lie that you have to pay for energy. You don't. Anyway, you asked me for a definition of energy.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing. In force, first I'm going to quote Feynman, Nobelist Feynman, who says, we really don't know what energy is. And he also said about force several things. You look at it in his 3 volumes of physics. He said, the main characteristic of force is it has a material origin. If you don't have matter, you have no force. That is a fact. But he said also,
Do it.